Aaron Martinez was born on April 30th, 1988, in El Salto, Jalisco, Mexico, to Salvador Martinez and Rosa Mejia. At the age of 35, he lived in Forney, Texas, with his wife Priscilla and their 2 kids, April and Aaron. Aaron worked as an electrical contractor at the Omni Hotel, and before that, he owned an electrical business called JVC Electric. His friends and family described him as a family man who enjoyed horses and the outdoors. He was very proud to be a U.S. citizen and dreamed of one day building a ranch, but sadly, that dream would lead to a horrible tragedy. Around late 2020 or early 2021, he and his wife opened a horse training ranch on Neal Road in Forney. Unbeknownst to them, they were moving in next to a mentally disturbed and deranged individual who would proceed to make their lives a living hell. That neighbor was Trevor McEwen, and he immediately made it clear that he hated Hispanics. He even told Aaron, and I quote, "We don't want you Spanish people in the area." McEwen continued confronting Aaron and his family and would constantly block their vehicles when they tried to leave. He would even follow Aaron's workers and cut them off using his truck. He would then get out of his truck and aim a gun at them while hurling insults. He also built a hunter's stand so he could watch and yell derogatory terms at them. Unfortunately, on May 1st, 2023, everything would come to a head. At 11 a.m., Aaron decided to leave to buy some construction supplies and pick up lunch for his 2 workers. Moments after Aaron left, the workers heard multiple gunshots. A witness would later say they saw McEwen ram Aaron's truck and then open fire on him. When deputies arrived, they found Aaron's black truck still running in the middle of the road, with Aaron dead inside from the gunshot wounds. That same afternoon, McEwen showed up at the Martinez's property, circled it twice before parking in the yard. Workers took shelter inside the house and quickly called 911. A SWAT team, including a helicopter, responded, and a several-hour standoff occurred. Eventually, McEwen surrendered and was taken into custody. When asked about Aaron's death, he admitted to killing him with his rifle. He was then charged with capital murder, arson, and 5 counts of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon and given a $2 million bond. The McEwen family protested the bond amount, and initially, the judge refused to reduce it. However, they continued pressing the court, and in August, it was reduced to $500,000, and using his family's finances, he was able to bond out. However, within a week, he had violated his terms, was rearrested, and once again was given a $2 million bond. He would spend about 3 months in jail before his family once again bailed him out. On May 5th, 2025, the day his trial was set to begin, McEwen removed his ankle monitor and went on the run. This started a manhunt east of Grand Saline, Texas, and he was added to the Texas Department of Public Safety's 10 Most Wanted Fugitive list. Nearly a month later, authorities found him hiding in a hole in the floor of his grandmother's home in Van Zant County. His grandmother was in her 90s, and it's not clear if she knew what had happened. During the trial, witnesses told the court about the gunfire at night, loud music, and constant damage to the property by McEwen. Even his ex-girlfriend was brought in and testified that McEwen was a very violent and abusive person who was constantly paranoid that people were watching him. She said he had even pointed a gun at her and then fired it, but moved the gun just enough so it missed her. She also talked about how scary it was to ride in a vehicle with him due to his extreme road rage. However, the defense went with the self-defense claim, and on the 3rd day of trial, McEwen took the stand in his own defense. He then tried to downplay his hate for Hispanics and tried to say the videos he took of the property were because he was hearing frequent gunfire in the area. He also lied, saying he didn't shoot his guns often and was simply running errands that day. However, he admitted to unloading 2 magazines into Aaron that day. He also looked at Aaron's phone after the shooting, tried to move his vehicle off the road, and unloaded Aaron's AR-15 and handgun. When asked about this, he said he was unloading the weapons for safety. The only problem with all of this is that McEwen was the only real danger, and sadly, because authorities never took the threat seriously, an innocent man lost his life. In the end, McEwen was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Alexandria Madison Kostial, who went by Allie, was born on September 11, 1997, in St. Louis, Missouri, to Cindy and Keith Kostial. Allie was described as a very outgoing and friendly individual. In school, she stood out as a cheerleader and was also a member of the track and field and golf teams. She also participated in youth in government and was a member of the National Honor Society. She loved adventure and had traveled to Peru and Africa as a volunteer helping locals learn English. After graduating from Lindbergh High School in 2016, she enrolled at the University of Mississippi in Oxford, also known as Ole Miss. During the first couple of years at college, she started and led the student golf and running clubs and taught yoga and Pilates classes. She also helped establish the Alpha Phi sorority and was a member of the Alpha Kappa Psi business fraternity. She wanted to work in the fashion industry after graduating with a degree in marketing, but would sadly never get the chance. Unfortunately, during her freshman year, she met Brandon Thiesfeld at a local bar, and the two began casually dating. Even though he treated her horribly, she wanted things to be more serious. Thiesfeld was from a very well-off family, and both his parents worked as doctors. However, he just didn't see the relationship the same, and when Allie got pregnant in April 2019, things took a horrible turn. After showing him a photo of the at-home pregnancy test, he told her to get some abortion pills, and then began ignoring her messages. He basically cut her out of his life and avoided her at all costs. That summer, Allie stayed in Oxford for classes, while Thiesfeld returned to Texas. She was preparing to start her senior year and had spent several days with her parents setting up her new off-campus apartment. Meanwhile, Thiesfeld, who was now back in Texas, posted a photo of a .40 caliber Glock 22 with the caption, "Finally taking my baby back to Oxford." By early July, Allie's request to meet with Thiesfeld in person became more frequent. On July 12th, he replied to a text that he didn't want to talk and that she should just schedule an appointment with a doctor. 4 days later, on July 16th, he returned to Oxford with the pistol. He then began searching online for information about silencers, hollow-tip ammunition, and the serial killer Ted Bundy. The next day, he strangely messaged Allie to meet, which was completely opposite of his earlier stance. He told her they could figure things out and agreed to meet in person to talk. On July 19th, while Allie was at a bar, he texted her and asked if he could visit her at her apartment. She agreed, and he told her to let him know when she got home. At 11:52 p.m., Allie was seen on surveillance footage walking out of the bar she had been at near Oxford Square and catching an Uber home. Once home, she let him know, and he came to pick her up. At around 1:14 a.m., his truck was seen leaving her apartment. They then drove about 45 minutes to the Sardis Lake area before parking and getting out of the vehicle. Between 2:15 and 2:30 a.m., 11 gunshots were heard. About 20 minutes later, both their phones were seen returning to Oxford. However, Allie was not in the vehicle with him, and her body wouldn't be discovered for another 8 hours. Once he was back in town, he began searching online for police scanners, most likely hoping to pick up the report of Allie's body being found. At around 8 a.m., 2.5 hours before her body was discovered, Thiesfeld sent a text to a friend and lied, saying he needed a place to crash because of an exterminator at his home, and the friend agreed. Thiesfeld and Allie's phones then showed activity in Batesville and Memphis before finally returning to Oxford. He then showed up at his friend's apartment at 9:58 a.m. Around 10:30 a.m., Allie's body was finally discovered. Investigators found 11 .40 caliber shell casings at the scene, and ballistics linked them to Thiesfeld's pistol. It was determined that they had sat down at a picnic table. Then at some point, he got up, walked around to Allie's backside, and fired the 11 shots. The last ping from Allie's phone was near the Waller Funeral Home at 1:28 p.m., the day she was murdered. The phone has never been recovered. It didn't take investigators long to track down Thiesfeld, and the following day, on July 21st, they asked if he could come in and talk. He agreed, but he never showed up and never planned to. When the police called him back, he said that he'd been drinking and didn't want to meet them while drunk. He agreed to come in early the next morning, July 22nd, but that was just another lie. On July 22nd, they then went to look for him and tracked him down at a gas station across the state line in South Memphis, and the .40 caliber used in the killing was found in his truck. Back at his apartment, investigators found a legal pad containing a 2-page, handwritten letter from him to his family. It was a confession that included the comment that he was either going to prison or going to die. Thiesfeld was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Sadly, an autopsy showed that Allie wasn't even pregnant, and there was no evidence to indicate she had ever been. Turns out it was just a false positive. At the start of the court proceedings, his attorney presented a mental evaluation from October 2020. The evaluation found that Thiesfeld was competent and sane and able to stand trial. In the end, in order to avoid the death penalty, he took a plea deal and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Unfortunately, under Mississippi law, he may petition for conditional release at the age of 65. Elizabeth Marriott, who went by Lizzi, was born on May 30th, 1993, in Worcester, Massachusetts, to parents Bob and Melissa Marriott. Lizzi loved animals and was known for saving local wildlife. She'd volunteered at the New England Aquarium and knew she wanted to become a marine biologist. So, at the age of 19, she transferred to the University of New Hampshire as a sophomore with plans to major in their marine biology program. Instead of moving into student housing, she chose to live with her aunt and uncle in Chester, New Hampshire, in order to save some money. Then, on October 9th, 2012, Lizzi's day started out like any other. She told her aunt and uncle she was going to a friend's house, but never said who the friend was, but told them she'd be home around midnight. Sadly, she would never return. When she wasn't home by the following morning, they were concerned, but figured she had decided to stay the night. However, when another day passed with no word, they knew something was terribly wrong and notified her parents, who lived a couple of hours away in Massachusetts. They immediately reported her missing and began calling everyone they knew. Investigators quickly learned that Lizzi was supposed to meet a friend named Kat McDonough that night. When police questioned her, she said Lizzi had strangely never shown up. One of Lizzi's co-workers from a Target she worked at, named Nate McNeil, also sent McDonough a message and received the same answer: Lizzi never came over. Investigators then began piecing together Lizzi's last known activities, starting with McDonough, who lived with her boyfriend, Seth Mazzillia. She was fairly well known around the community and, by all accounts, appeared to be your average teenager. She and Mazzillia had met in the summer of 2011 through the local theater scene. After meeting him, friends and acquaintances said she changed dramatically. She was only 17 when she met 29-year-old Mazzillia, and they moved in together shortly after turning 18 and quickly cut off all contact with her family. Mazzillia worked at a local electronics store, taught martial arts, and was a trained EMT. However, he had a very dark sexual side and was addicted to bondage websites. McDonough had even gotten involved, and she began posing dark pictures of herself online using screen names such as Vampire Actress and Miss Scarlet. She, just like Mazzillia, became obsessed with BDSM. So they began advertising on fetish websites, looking to bring a third person into their relationship. 3 days after Lizzi's disappearance, investigators were convinced McDonough and Mazzillia knew something. So they brought them in for questioning and placed them in separate interrogation rooms. She stuck to her story that Lizzi never came over, and about 2 hours into the interview, she stopped answering questions. Since they had no ground to hold her, they let her go. However, she didn't leave, and instead waited there for Mazzillia. For 11 hours, he was interviewed by detectives and told a very different story from McDonough. He said Lizzi was at the apartment the night she went missing. He said there was sex, something went wrong, and Lizzi died. He said after she died, he panicked and brought her body to Pierce Island, where the Piscataqua River meets the Atlantic Ocean. They immediately began searching, but no trace of Lizzi was found. Meanwhile, Mazelia was arrested and charged with Lizzi's murder. Investigators searched their apartment and the apartment's dumpster. In the dumpster, they found a pair of gloves, men's underwear, and Lizzi's sweatshirt. McDonough told police that Mazelia used the gloves to strangle Lizzi. Meanwhile, the search at the Piscataqua River continued for weeks, but Lizzi's body was never found. An ex-girlfriend of Mazelia named Catherine came forward and provided some shocking information about him. She said she always knew that he would eventually murder someone. She was asked if she thought it was a sexual encounter gone wrong, but she said no. She fully believed it was just murder. She said he had fantasized about murder a lot when she was with him. She said he was always into the BDSM type thing, and as their relationship continued, the sex became increasingly violent and sexually abusive. She said one time he put his hands fully around her neck and began choking her. When she asked him to stop, he just did it harder. Catherine says Mazelia was always trying to bring other women into their bed. She said as the relationship continued, he gradually took control of her life to the point where she felt she couldn't leave. She was 600 miles from home and afraid if she left, he would kill her. Eventually, she made the tough decision to leave and went into hiding. 2 days after Mazelia's arrest, McDonough hired an attorney and changed her story. She was now admitting that Lizzi had been at the apartment that night and stuck to Mazelia's story that Lizzi's death had been an accident. She told investigators the night had started with the three of them watching a movie and playing cards. She claims that at some point that night, the three of them became involved in a threesome. She said it went from silly to sexual, but then quickly got very intense. She claimed Lizzi agreed to be tied up with bondage ropes and even drew a diagram of the harness. She even got on her knees in the interrogation room to explain how Lizzi died that night. She said after tying Lizzi into the harness, she had a seizure, suffocated, and died. She said she was freaking out, but investigators noticed something strange while she was telling the story. She was saying the word, but looked very unemotional and almost upbeat about the death of her friend. However, Lizzi's friend Nate McNeil, who knew both girls, says Lizzi would have never agreed to do something like that, especially with a guy she had only met once. Plus, Lizzi was in a long-term relationship with a girl named Brittany. McNeil said she constantly spoke about how much she cared for Brittany and about the fun things they did together, reaffirming that she would have never agreed to BDSM and definitely not with a stranger. On Christmas Eve 2012, McDonough was also arrested and charged with hindering apprehension and prosecution in connection with Lizzi's murder. By 2013, she had changed her story and confirmed everyone's suspicions that Mazelia had in fact murdered Lizzi and that she had lied to investigators with the story of the harness. She then took a plea deal requiring her to spend up to 3 years in prison and testify against Mazelia. In May 2014, 2 years after Lizzi Marriott died under mysterious circumstances, Seth Mazelia went on trial for her murder, and it was McDonough's testimony that proved to be the most critical. According to her, Mazelia had ordered her to find a friend for him and would allegedly punish her if she didn't. In one text from him to her, it read, "You choose a friend, any of yours will do, and you offer her to me, that I may do anything I wish with her, while you watch." That's when her search for a girl intensified, and she reached out to Lizzi and invited her over. Lizzi arrived at the apartment at 8:51 p.m. The three of them decided on a movie and, at McDonough's suggestion, a game of strip poker. She said she ended up wearing nothing, while Lizzi was just in her underwear. That's when she said Mazelia made his move and suggested the girls kiss. However, Lizzi refused, saying she was in a committed relationship. He then asked if he could have sex with her, and once again she refused. This angered Mazelia, as he didn't like being told no. The girls went back to watching the movie, while he quietly put on gloves and grabbed a rope. He then came up behind Lizzi, put the rope around her neck, and strangled her to death. Those gloves were later found in the dumpster. Sadly, McDonough never did anything to save her friend. She didn't tell him to stop, she didn't seek help, and then she lied to investigators. Roberta Gherkin, a friend of Mazzilia's, said she got a strange call from McDonough around 10:49 p.m., asking for help with something, so she and her boyfriend, Paul, went to the apartment, arriving a little after 11 p.m., and when they walked inside, they saw Lizzi's body on the floor right next to the bed. When they asked him what happened, he just repeated that he had gone too far this time. They urged him to call an ambulance, but he refused. Not wanting to be involved, they left. But do you think they called 911? Nope. This couple saw a dead girl on the floor and decided to just wash their hands of it. After they left, Mazzilia and McDonough located Lizzie's car, put her body in it, and drove 13 miles to the New Hampshire coast. Once there, they parked at the end of Pierce Island and brought Lizzie's body, which was wrapped in a tarp and stuffed in a suitcase, up a path to an overlook above the river. Once there, they took Lizzie's body out of the suitcase and tossed it over the cliff. She said it was low tide and her body hit the rock about 35 feet below them. So Mazzilia ordered McDonough to climb down, cover her in seaweed, and push her into the water, and that's exactly what she did. She said they spent the remaining hours of the night throwing away evidence and left Lizzie's car in a dark parking lot at the University of New Hampshire and then walked the 6 miles home. In the end, Seth Mazzilia was found guilty of first-degree murder by strangulation, guilty of first-degree sexual assault and murder, and guilty on 2 counts of conspiracy. He was later sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Considering McDonough led Lizzie to her death and then helped cover it up, she got off with a very light sentence. She served the entire 3 years and was released in July of 2016. Sadly, Lizzie's body was most likely carried out to the Atlantic Ocean, and it's unlikely it will ever be found. Jessica Dawn Dishon was born on May 2, 1982, in Shepherdsville, Kentucky, to parents Edna and Mike Dishon. At the age of 17, she lived in the Knobs area of Shepherdsville on Deedsville Road and was a senior at Bullitt Central High School. She loved cooking, especially for her family, and wanted to study culinary arts. Sadly, she would never get the chance. Friday morning, September 10th, 1999, started just like any other morning. Jessica's parents had left for work, and her younger brothers, Christopher and Michael, had caught the school bus. Meanwhile, Jessica got ready for school and then went and sat in her car, getting ready to leave. However, when her mother, Edna, returned home at 1:30 p.m., she found Jessica's car sitting in the driveway in the same spot. She looked inside and found Jessica's backpack, work uniform, purse, and one of her shoes on the driver's side floor. Jessica's cell phone was on the seat, and it looked like she tried to call 911, but only the numbers 9 and 1 were on the screen. Edna knew immediately that something was wrong. In a panic, she began calling around, searching for her. Mike got home soon after and tried to calm Edna, saying maybe Jessica was with a friend. But there's nothing greater than a mother's instinct. They called the school to see if Jessica had shown up, and when the school said she had not, they called the Bullitt County Sheriff's Office. Deputy David Greenwell answered, and Mike explained what was going on. Deputy Greenwell asked Detective Charles Mann for help more than once, but Mann refused, saying Jessica was just a runaway and would come back. Even though police thought she was a runaway, they still put out missing posters with her information. When the police did not do enough, Mike contacted the FBI for help, and they put together a search party and started looking for Jessica. As news began to spread, 2 brothers, David Brooks, who went by Bucky, and Joseph Brooks, who were neighbors of the Dishons, strangely began making harassing phone calls to the family. Their behavior was extremely odd, and it would eventually lead to one of them being arrested and falsely accused of being involved in Jessica's disappearance. Police eventually arrested both brothers and charged them with making harassing phone calls and stalking members of the Dishon family during the investigation. While the search continued for Jessica, the brothers remained at the top of the suspect list. On September 27th, 17 days after Jessica went missing, her body was found by bus driver Karen Hobbs. she caught a glimpse of a body lying in the grass about 60 to 90 feet off Greenwell Ford Road in the river bottoms, about 7 or 8 miles from the Dishon's home. Edna rushed to the scene and confirmed it was her daughter. She'd sadly been beaten and strangled to death. The Bullitt County Sheriff's Office, with assistance from the FBI, determined that Jessica was likely held for at least a couple of days before her body was left there. They believed the killer had purposely left her body near the road so it would be found. Investigators quickly brought Bucky back in for questioning. During the interrogation, he said he was working on his family's farm and saw Jessica get into her car that morning. Later, he changed his story and said he hadn't seen her at all. He was then given a polygraph test and failed. With no solid alibi, a failed polygraph, and changing stories, the police decided to charge him with kidnapping and murder. Unfortunately, most people weren't aware that Bucky had a very low IQ and was considered intellectually disabled, which made him vulnerable to coercive questioning. On January 18, 2001, Bucky Brooks was indicted and arrested for the kidnapping and murder of Jessica. However, in early 2003, his trial ended in a mistrial, and on September 5th of that same year, all his charges were dismissed after prosecutors decided not to retry him. This was due to a lack of physical evidence and the fact that polygraphs are not admissible in court. With the real killer still out there, a new detective by the name of Lynn Hunt was assigned to the case, and she was a cold case specialist. What was soon to come would shock everyone. On September 30th, 2013, an inmate at the state prison informed Hunt of a cellmate who claimed to be in a cell with a man who had confessed to kidnapping Jessica, holding her hostage for a couple of days before ultimately killing her. That confession came from none other than Jessica's piece-of-shit uncle, Stanley Dishon. He had a long criminal history, including several sexual assaults on young girls, and had been in and out of jail over the years. According to the informant, Stanley claimed he mutilated her remains to try and make it look like drug dealers or the mafia had killed her. He was reportedly angry that she had started dating a boy her own age. When he was telling his cellmate the details, he referred to Jessica and her new boyfriend by derogatory names. It appeared he'd murdered her in a jealous rage. It's unclear if her family knew, but he'd been sexually abusing Jessica for years, and she'd threatened to tell her boyfriend about it. There was one more crucial detail that the informant provided. Apparently, Stanley had buried some of Jessica's personal belongings under a fallen tree near where she was killed. If they could find these items, it would confirm the story. So Hunt and Jessica's brother, Michael, spent hours searching for evidence. They dug nearly 200 holes, some in the rain, before finally deciding to stop. They then checked a barn, which Stanley had access to, about a mile from where Jessica was found. Michael was familiar with the barn as he'd hung out in it when he was younger. Inside one of the buildings, they found material that looked like Jessica's bed sheet. When they got back to the Dishon home, they saw the sheet from Jessica's bed was missing. Through interviews, Detective Hunt figured out where Stanley lived from his teenage years until his arrest in 2002. She discovered that he'd moved between siblings' homes and abused many of their children. He then lived with Jessica's family from 1989 to about 1996. The inmate who spoke to police said Stanley was sexually abusing Jessica during that time. There was also Stanley's behavior during the first search for Jessica that had made many people suspicious of him. On the first morning, when the search group got within a mile of where Jessica's body was later found, Stanley became physically sick. His wife at the time, Carol Ann Walters, said he became obsessed with watching the news and began having trouble sleeping. However, the family had a hard time believing Stanley could be responsible. Michael, on the other hand, said if Stanley was guilty, he deserved the death penalty. As the investigation went on, more of Stanley's victims came forward. When the family met with one of them and asked what Stanley had done, she fainted from being overwhelmed. In total, Stanley's victims included at least 3 other family members. On October 2, 2013, Stanley was arrested and charged with Jessica's murder and several counts of sexual assault for the sexual abuse of Jessica and other family members. The first victim was abused by him between the ages of 6 and 9, and then again between the ages of 15 and 20. Another victim was a 7-year-old relative, a 10-year-old girl, and another girl who was 8 years old. In a shocking turn of events, Stanley was allowed to enter an Alford plea, which means he didn't have to admit to anything. All he had to do was plead guilty to 4 counts of sexual assault and to manslaughter in Jessica's case. In the end, he only got 20 years and could be eligible for parole as early as December 31st, 2028. If he serves his full term, he will be released in 2033. What's even crazier is that during Bucky Brooks' trial, investigators had a letter from a second prison informant dated 2002 that pointed to Stanley being the killer. The informant said he confessed to the crime and explained that he had dumped the body in the river bottoms. Why they continued prosecuting an innocent man with that information in hand is beyond me. I would normally end the video by saying, thankfully, this horrible individual is now behind bars, but sadly, he could be free in 2033, or even earlier, to wreak havoc on society once again. Robert Glenn Bryant, who went by the nickname Rocky, was born on May 28, 1953, and grew up in Seagraves, Texas. He graduated from Seagraves High School in 1972 and was known for his big smile, his corny jokes, and his willingness to help anyone in need. Rocky spent more than 2 decades working at the local feed plant Agri-Alliance, just outside of Seagraves, and was the kind of person who made coffee for his coworkers every morning and always had a joke to share before starting the day. Rocky was engaged to Patricia Graves, and the two lived together next door to the plant. On the morning of March 25, 2008, a coworker found Rocky at 7:30 a.m. lying on the floor of the fertilizer warehouse at the plant. At first, Patricia was told that Rocky had suffered a heart attack. Apparently, they came to that conclusion because of his history of heart problems. However, it soon became clear that something much worse had happened. When Patricia arrived, Rocky was still alive, but in a lot of pain. He told her that his legs, back, and neck hurt, and the only thing he could say was that someone had beaten him up. EMS took him to Brownfield Regional, and he was then airlifted to the University Medical Center in Lubbock, where he sadly died several hours later from his injuries. Investigators determined that someone had been waiting for Rocky at work and attacked him from behind. They brought in a K-9 unit to try and track the suspect, and about a quarter-mile from the warehouse, they found some evidence and sent it off for testing. What that evidence was is not known publicly, but it didn't help locate the killer, and the case went cold. In January 2013, a new sheriff reassigned the case and invited the cold justice team to assist. From there, they learned that his wife Patricia was having an affair with a man named Jose Luis Barrial. On July 11, 2013, Jose was arrested and charged with Rocky's murder. Later that same month, Patricia was arrested as well and also charged with first-degree murder. Unfortunately, the evidence in the case was very weak, and in February 2014, Patricia was allowed to take a plea deal that only gave her a 10-year deferred adjudication. This means she was basically on probation for 10 years and would remain that way as long as she stayed out of trouble and paid the $2,500 fine, along with the court costs and fees, and served 250 hours of community service. Even though prosecutors believed that Jose was the one to commit the actual crime, they didn't have the physical evidence to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, and his case was ultimately dismissed in 2017. Regardless, Rocky Bryant's case is now closed, and many believe that justice was never truly served.